Is it me, or does it seem that the news this week was more violent than usual? And I mean on a kind of personal basis. I noticed there was a supermarket shooting in Elkhart, Indiana, two school shootings, one in Roswell, New Mexico, another in Philadelphia by young people. There was a man, I don't remember where, who killed someone in a movie theater because he threw popcorn at him, shot him dead. This weekend, the nation is observing, as you know, the King birthday, and does there seem to be some irony that suddenly we're observing the life of a man who championed nonviolence in a culture that seems to be remarkably violent, even more so than a few years ago? Few Sundays are more daunting to the preacher, or at least to this preacher, than to speak of Dr. Martin Luther King. I could just read any one of his sermons, and all of them are better than all of my sermons. But you can do that on your own, and it's not the eloquence that I'm here to try to match, it's the authenticity. Because a sermon well preached is not the beauty of the words, but the reality of the preacher and the invitation to become alive. Who am I to speak? No more than you, but it is the task I was given. And more than most Sundays, I begin by saying, may these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my redeemer. Lest we forget, Dr. King was a Baptist, and like every good Baptist, he preached based on biblical texts. And so I'm going to open up that little text we heard earlier about Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, reminding, or pleading, in fact, with Moses to disperse this job of making judgments, serving as a magistrate. Mind you, as I said before, Jethro was not a Levite or a Benjaminite or a kinsman. He was outside the children of Israel altogether. He was an outside observer, but he had interest in Moses, being his son-in-law, being therefore married to his daughter. And I don't know about you, but I think it's the rare man whose father-in-law dispenses wisdom so gently. And so I admire Jethro for caring about his son-in-law and advising him that the job he's doing can be shared. I'm thinking about this text because if you take the story away and look at the process, what Jethro is saying is you can democratize justice. It doesn't have to be done by the king or the prophet. It doesn't have to be done by important people. It can be done by the people if they're trained and if they're honest. And as I think about that, that is in some ways what Martin Luther King did in calling that movement into being with his message. He was asking each of those people who followed him to dispense justice individually with their marching, their protesting, and their resisting nonviolently, that each of them acted as a judge to the community by standing up and taking the imprecations and condemnations of society. How did Dr. King get to this point where he knew this was the way to go? That's the story I want to give you this morning, because you can take that story and apply it to your life. For those who weren't there, and I wasn't, for those too young to have been there, it was on December 1st of 1955, a year, not even or so, after the famous Brown versus Board of Education ruling from the Supreme Court that Rosa Parks wouldn't get up. Now, she made this as a very calculated choice. That doesn't mean it was sneaky or underhanded, but this was the time she wasn't going to yield. And she was arrested, and she was tried and found guilty of breaking the law, and she was fined $10 plus $4 for court costs. The distance between her arrest was 3 days. She was arrested on the 1st and tried on the 4th. In between, the African American clergy came together and realized this was the moment when they could stand up and demand change. But of course, there were many clergy in that town, and each of them probably fancied himself to be the leader. But the leader of the NAACP, Edgar Nixon, and his friend Ralph Abernathy realized that they needed someone who wasn't, shall we say, beholden to the community, someone who had intelligence and liberty. And so they said, why don't we elect that young man over there, Dr. King. He was 27 years old. 27. I'm twice his age and have not accomplished 100th of what he's done. The reason you need to know this is that over the year of the boycott that came, 385 days roughly, he and Ralph Abernathy had their houses firebombed. He was jailed for at least 2 weeks, although he was sentenced to a year in jail for not riding the bus. Do you realize the boycott was considered illegal because it violated an interference with commerce law in Alabama? Think about that. If they got on the bus, they couldn't sit down. If they didn't get on the bus, they went to jail. And he was accused, tried, and convicted of interfering with commerce. Fortunately, the judge, privately and only years later, confessed to paying his fine 2 weeks later. But that is the exact outcome Dr. King brought out in people, of having to obey the law, and by obeying the law to violate their consciences. The boycott succeeded, but it did take a year and a court ruling and 2 court rulings. And I learned this story only years later because I was a toddler when this happened. Then and now, as I heard it, and today, even as I repeat it, I am utterly humbled by the courage he and others had, not only to mount the boycott, but to endure threats. Not only were their houses firebombed, but people shot at black people not getting on buses, assaulted them when they got into taxi cabs, and yet they did not yield. But let's move on. Between 1955, when this started, and 1968, when he was murdered, Dr. King, paragon of virtue, was arrested 29 times. I could go on, but my point today is not to extol him or lift him up. Others can do that far better than I. I am here to learn and to share what I have learned with you. Now, let me put a little context. Last week I started reviewing our basic principles as a liberal church and of liberal religion, and spoke about freeing the mind, a commitment to self-education and self-liberation of the mind so that we might make really strong and convicting choices about our beliefs and our religious values. As you heard George Zeiderveen repeat earlier today, that the other things we do are to commit ourselves to growing our souls and changing the world. And while they are usually recited in that pattern, today I'm going to invert them a little bit because of the King holiday, about changing the world. King is the model, obviously. And I'm telling you exactly what he had that we all want, but we don't want it bad enough to get it. Moral courage. King had profound moral courage. We know this because that's what lets you get arrested 29 times, get your house firebombed, put you in the way of harm. But I'm going to borrow my own phrase to say you find your moral courage by becoming morally competent. If we're going to change the world, you need to know right from wrong, good from bad, justice from injustice. You have to understand those things and then conform your life to those realities. In an epistle attributed to his brother James, the brother of Jesus, James says, "Do not merely listen to the word, but do what it says." This is important because there are millions who are listening to sermons today, feeling justified, and then going home and changing nothing about their lives. Because it's hard. Because we do have principles, and they are great principles. But words without action is the very definition of hypocrisy. So if I mean for us to be morally competent, I better tell you exactly what that is. And foremost, it means judgment. Now, we make judgments all the time, usually rather small ones. What shall I wear today? My tie I bought in Texas or the one that my mother-in-law gave me? Shall I have the usual breakfast or shall I break from my habit? All of our work lives, those of us who have jobs, and all of us have jobs whether we're paid or not, do nothing but exert judgment. The carpenter must know where to cut. And as we all know, better to measure twice and cut once. Teachers have to exert judgment to treat each child with enough distinction that they learn, but not so much distinction that they are distracted. And yes, even the unemployed and the homeless exert judgments about where they're going to hold out their placards or sleep under a bridge. Every day we make choices. And each of these choices have consequences, how be they small. Some of them, though, these choices will have lasting effects. So you know you want to make the right choice for more than convenient reasons.